So, there was a lovely VR post. And by lovely, I mean... it could have used some improvement. There was a VR post recently made in the SS Viability Rankings thread. And it was someone nominating down Xatu. And when I saw the post, you know, I'm thinking at first, I'm going to, alright, there are certainly reasons to think Xatu is not as well off as it used to be. The rise of Guzzlord, for instance, has definitely put a damper on how effective Xatu has. Copperage sort of like dropping off as a rocks setter in favor of running different sets, meaning there's one less stealth rock setter that you can just blank really easily. The rise of Golurk being another huge one. Just in general, Pokemon that Xatu does not fare very well against have gotten more common. So I'm thinking, okay, if they base an argument around this, then maybe I can see it. And the problem ended up being that the person that was talking about why they thought Xatu should drop, their points about it, they were a little weak. Most of which, talking about how Xatu can't actually bounce hazards back very well because, you know, oh, the common rockers right now beat it. And this post made me kind of inspired to do a whole video on Xatu in modern and new generations. I say modern NU generations, counting Gen 6 and onward, because, well, Xatu's only been NU in one other generation, that being GSC, and I am just not familiar at all with GSC Xatu. Plus, it's actually, like, way too functionally different to cover in a video like this. So we're gonna stick to generations where Xatu's role has remained pretty consistent, where it's got the same tools, mostly, for the most part. We'll get into a couple generational differences, obviously, when we're talking about differences between Gen 6 and 7 compared to 8. But that post made me inspired to make a video on Xatu, because Xatu is essentially defined NU in ways that very few other Pokemon can even begin to try to contest. You know, when you're thinking about Pokemon that have been NU forever, it's like, what? Garbodor is going to be probably the other one that you think about. But if you want to talk about a mon that has consistently always been at the top of the metagame, which Garbodor, can't really say this gen, then Xatu's going to be the one that you're talking about. Xatu on every VR right now is ranked like A rank or higher, and it's for good reason. But if we want to talk about why Xatu's so dominant, I think we need to first talk about like what it does. That gives us our baseline. And the key point that we really need to first consider is Magic Bounce. Now, this has always been one of the best abilities in the game. Like, to segue a little bit to something else, or not to segue, but to draw a point to somewhere else. Cap, the little creative Pokemon project. Yeah, they really like to give broken abilities to Pokemon, or at least suggest them to be given. And obviously Magic Bounce is going to be one of those, because it's incredibly good. It lets you shut down a whole bunch of passive Pokemon. It lets you block hazards from going up if you can, you know, play your Pokemon properly. It denies passive play really effectively, and of course, conversely, rewards proactive play. And I think people, a lot of the time, love to underestimate how good Magic Bounce is. So, the biggest point that I think is always going to be brought up against Xatu, and of course, harkening back to what the VR post said that inspired this video, was, what if Xatu doesn't beat the hazard setter that's on the other team? To that I say, it doesn't really matter. So, let's get one thing straight. So if we're talking in Gen 6 NU, for instance, the big reason Xatu's, like, I don't know if it's the best mon in the tier. I had to reach out to someone else to give me a little bit better Oras knowledge, because admittedly, I'm not very familiar with the gen. But Xatu is S rank. It's one of the best Pokemon. And, you know, if we mosey on over to their VR rankings, look at the best hazard setters right now. We won't even go below anything else, and, I mean, there's really not too many other top-tier hazard setters. But if we look at what's an A+, two mods immediately stand out, and that's Steelix and Garbodor. And Xatu just literally blanks these Pokemon. This is one of those cases in which Xatu is allowed to just not centralize a tier, but be right at the top of the tier. Because its main job, if you're trying to shut down passive Pokemon, well look, two of the best Pokemon in this tier are incredibly passive. Steelix and Garbodor are two Pokemon that when they run their very defensive sets, Steelix only really being able to go Curse or some lure set with Sheer Force if it wants to bypass Xatu, whereas Garbodor has to, pray with Gunk Shot. But because these Pokemon are so commonly running sets that can't really do anything about Xatu, it gets to turn teams that are reliant on these Pokemon into just very ineffective builds. And while you can of course take advantage of Xatu in this gen with Pursuit support, if you're looking at other top tier Pokemon, Liepard and Skuntank are very high on that list. Both of them can definitely punish Xatu if you don't get plays correct with it. But in general, Xatu is able to make these two Pokemon a lot less effective at just throwing up your hazards and trying to win the game like that. And the same kind of goes for Sun and Moon and you. If you're looking at hazard setters that are prevalent, you've got Seismitoad, you've got more Steelix, and while Steelix in Sun and Moon has had periods of time where it ran Curse a lot, I would say that the more common set right now, or the one that one of the sets at least I see a lot, is one that goes Toxic, Roar, Stealth Rock, Heavy Slam. Basically, people have just dropped off running Curse in favor of Roar. It does the same thing against Substitute Bulk Up Braviary, or even just generally Bulk Up Braviary because they run Flyinium Z. Getting really specific there, but the TLDR, of course, there. Xatu doesn't really care about those sets. It doesn't care about defensive Seismitoad. It does not like offensive Seismitoad, obviously, but again, that's another point. We don't have to worry about that yet. We'll cover that later. Defensive Garbodor, again, incredibly prevalent. Don't get Gunk Shot poisoned and you're fine. Wheezing. Don't get Sludge Bomb poisoned and you're fine. And then, if we really want to look, in my opinion, the generation that really just defines Xatu denying hazard setters the best. Diancie actually doesn't really beat Xatu that effectively, because Diamond Storm isn't doing enough to you to where you can't roost stall it. If Diancie's not Moonblast, it actually is very, very prone to Xatu saying, alright, I'm just going to let you either KO yourself against my helmet as I take your body presses, regardless of if you get them boosted, or I'm gonna roost stall you out of all your Diamond Storms, and that'll be that. Copperajah, we covered that a little earlier. But Copperajah, obviously it can't really force Stealth Rock against you. It doesn't do enough with Heavy Slam, and it'll just KO itself again with your helmet. Bronzong. Please tell me the Bronzong set that beats Xatu. If you tell me Trick Toxic Orb, I'll say you're correct, but I will not like you. What are some other ones? Mudsdale. Yeah, it can pressure Xatu if it runs some of those sets that go a little bit of offensive investment, but the point stands, Mudsdale can't rock up versus Xatu. It's really just down to these nicher Stealth Rock options like Palossand and Rhydon if you're looking for something that can actually get rocks up. And so, you can see it's just this common theme. Xatu, in terms of the hazard game, it's sort of always played a really key role in defining it. But another thing I think Xatu kind of doesn't get enough credit for is just the bog standard pivot set that has literally existed in every generation, right? Whether it's something like Psychic, Grass Knot, U-Turn Roost, Grass Knot, it's good coverage. Heat Wave finding its way on there. Subsets just utilizing Nightshade for constant consistent damage, my bad. Xatu's just always been able to be like a really bad defensive switch into certain Pokemon. But one that's like, you invest enough in its bulk, you can take on certain resistant hits. Or even just take like one hit from a powerful attacker and then pivot out with U-turn or, a Gen 8 teleport. I think a couple of key examples that you want to look for when you talk about this, you're talking about like SMNU, Passimian's going to be the one that comes to mind immediately. Xatu's one of the best deterrents to close combat. Also pivots, also punishes U-turn pivoting, which is, really good. If you talk about Oras, Hariyama, another top tier mon, if you could just, again, punish that CC, that's really helpful, and it pivot out with U-turn, because, well, it'll be faster. Another helpful thing there. And then, we kind of already covered this when talking about SS, but if you're talking about, like, bulky Copperajah sets, Stealth Rock Copperajah sets, you can force those to self-KO. Diancie, it's not strong enough to two-hit KO you with anything, so you can force those to self-KO. You're talking about, if we think about like choice lock mons, frankly, there really aren't too many. I mean, Passimian again comes up, but something like Talonflame, a mon that's just not strong enough to threaten you with anything unless it runs one of those more niche Sword Stance sets. You know, you pivot in on any status move it tries to use, you force it to take a hell of a lot of recoil between Brave Bird, Natural Recoil, and Helmet, and again, you just roost off. This pivot set's always just existed in every generation, because what Xatu loves to be able to do is come in just hard against these passive do-nothing Pokemon that can't force any real damage onto it unless they get lucky with maybe hacks, you know, again. Talk about a Garbodor Gunk Shot poison or a Weezing Sludge Bomb poison. It comes in, and then those mons are forced out, so Xatu gets to freely U-turn. Or if they stay in, I mean, well, look, you're still pivoting out. And I think that's really where Teleport in in Sword and Shield has helped Xatu. Just because a lot of these Pokemon, for the most part, again, I do want to emphasize that, since most of these Pokemon can't really do anything back to you, having that guaranteed slow pivot is so huge. Because if you're looking at Oras and then, of course, SM, the gen I'm more familiar with, people really would like to get greedy against Xatu. And they'd say, okay, of course I'd switch my Steelix out now, so I'm gonna rock up again. And if Xatu U-turns, yeah, that actually works. But in SM, or not in SM, I'm misspeaking so much. But in SS, that does not matter at all. Because you get the slow pivot teleport. And obviously some Xatu still do go U-turn, so it's not always a present play, but I think it's still important to mention that Sword and Shield has gifted Xatu a way to kind of just deny aggressive play against it, which in general is one of the best ways to handle Xatu. And we'll talk about that more in a minute, but I do want to also focus on one thing in Oras when you're talking about Xatu in specific. And that is, as you look through the generations, Xatu is actually like more than just this like passive mon denier when it comes to at least Oras. Like, we're looking at generation-specific sets. I think one that is worth mentioning is Calm Mind Xatu in Oras. I was talking with Cutiel about this. He did want to make a note that this is not like some defining set, right? At the end of the day, it is still just your standard pivot defensive Xatu that's putting in all the work that you want here. Because, again, it's the most consistent at denying just other passive mods from making steady progress through hazards or status. It provides a lot through pivoting with U-turn, or in Sword and Shield Xatu's case, teleport, if it chooses to employ that. And also, this kind of a, we can look at Cresselia as a really weird example here, but CM Xatu is overall pretty weak, right? It takes a good amount of boosts to really get going. If you're thinking about teams that this set was featured on the most, I think that standard Teddy Balance team, and for those that don't know what that means, it refers to a very specific build of Inu. I've got it somewhere here titled it Boring. But it refers to this 6, where CM Xatu is pretty frequently employed on this team as a sort of win condition, because otherwise, you look at the team, there's really, like, when is this team winning? When is it threatening a win, right? The best answer I would have otherwise is, like, Liepard, because it's generically fast, and it maybe can clean up late game. But otherwise, you're really reliant on, just hoping you outlast your opponent. And that's not too good. So, Calm Mind Xatu appears on this sort of build because it helps give you a defined win condition, something that you can always work towards. And I think that's really valuable. And there's also a lot of variations in Oras as well. Like, Keyberry's Stored Power Xatu is actually something I've gotten run down by. And it's obviously a play on the CM Xatu set. And we've seen CM Xatu pop up in more recent generations too, right? Like, in SM and SS, it's still seen some use. I could probably find a replay somewhere in a tournament game for SS CM Xatu. Maybe, I almost saw it in NUPL. The main thing that I think is important to point out with that set, though, is it has fallen off in more recent generations of Inu because you just can't really keep up with the power creep as easily. It's kind of just required an increasingly heavy amount of support to really get going, per se. And with Pokemon like, say, Incineroar being introduced in Sun and Moon, and then just especially with Sword and Shield, the power creep becoming really immense, these sets for Xatu have become a lot less effective than they once were. And so, again, ORAS, it's sort of like a very specific pick that you use in, very specific circumstances. But it is still effective, and I thought that it was worth mentioning for at least the context of ORAS. If you want to look at Sun and Moon, for one that's a little bit more specific to it, this might be present in ORAS too, but honestly, I've just seen other mons used more for this. Dual screen Xatu is actually pretty prevalent on Hyper Offense. It's, in my eyes, the best option because a lot of Hyper Offense teams will run them on like Power Trip and Incineroar, and you really don't want that taking damage. I should have a team with this somewhere. I'm very scared to scroll through my team names here. Let's see if I get cancelled for anything in here, because I'm very worried. Here we go. Excellent. I found this team. I'm kidding when I say it, guys. Don't worry. But something like this is pretty prevalent on these teams, because if you're looking at common mons, I mean, do you want these mons getting weakened at all? Incineroar really, again, it needs the bulk. It needs the health, especially if you're doing, like, on this team, Substitute. They run Drain Punch as well, but, something like Sub-Incin, it needs the health. Mismagius, it's not very strong. You don't want to be pushed into Revenge Kill range of something like Passimian. Kabutops, well, look, you've got Aqua Jet. And this is a pretty, like, different Hyper Offense team, if I'm gonna be straight with y'all. But the point stands. Xatu supports this team really well as a dual screen setter. It stills denying from pretty much every hazard setter bar Moldbreaker Drotagon the ability to get up hazards. You just lead with it against a lot of teams and you get your screens up. And there's not much that stops you. I think that's the real nice thing too about Xatu's bulk. It's a really poor defensive switch into most things, all things considered. But with investment, you're generally good enough to take like one strong hit from something. Like in SM, for instance, since we're looking at that right now. You could take a Passimian knockoff. It's going to do a lot, but you could take it with the investment. You could take... I'm trying to think like another just strong wall breaker. You could take like a Specs Whimsicott's Moonblast. I could also just look at this, because... look at me, I did this. You also just... Because you're so fast, you could get the jump on things like Pangoro, which is really good. And then we're talking about like SS Xatu. Really the big thing that has set Xatu apart in SS compared to previous generations, well, there's two things. We talked about one of them previously, that's Teleport. But a big benefit to getting Teleport, as we said, being able to ease play against aggressive, like, passive mods, if that makes any sense, is just guaranteeing that you pivot out slowly. You don't want to let people try to... Xatu's a mon. Let me just start this sentence over. Xatu is a Pokemon that rewards you playing aggressively. And giving your opponent any sort of, like, advantageous positioning off of their own aggressive plays is something you want to try to avoid. And Teleport helps give you a lot more control over that, just because of the slow pivot. We pretty much said that before, but I thought it was worth bringing up again, just as this specific, dividing point. And I think another thing that really doesn't go noted enough is the fact that Pursuit is gone in this gen. Not having to worry about things like a Choice Bandit Sneasel, or a Skuntank, or Liepard, doubling in on your Xatu and enforcing this just disgusting 50-50 play. Hell, Aerodactyl even. It's really nice. Because, again, we're talking about aggressive play. Yeah, that's also kind of how you just beat up on Xatu. If you can play aggressively against it, force damage onto it as it keeps coming in, position yourself better so that you could just threaten it out, it's really good for you, because it lets you keep up the momentum against the mon that's kind of just designed to deny momentum. Xatu not having to worry about Pursuit's so nice though, because now it's... Z-moves and Pursuit being gone mean that there are a lot of Pokemon that lack a good way to punish Xatu now, even through some really aggressive play. You know, you don't have to worry about some, you know, Mon teching an offensive set, at least as frequently anymore, just to beat you. You know, there's no, like, Z-move Seismitoad looking to just Hydro Vortex you as you come in. You can just, you know, safely deny hazards for most Pokemon. You know, Garbodor isn't Okoyu with Acid Downpour anymore. But where do we talk about Xatu's shortcomings? Because I've gone on this long tirade about just how good Xatu is. How it's been a pretty defining piece of every single metagame of NU for the past, what? Approaching a decade? Alright, my B, we are back. Unfortunately, people in this household need me way too frequently. Beside the point. So, we talked about Xatu. We talked about a whole bunch of benefits to it. Why it's run this tier for God knows how long, a decade? It's what? It's 2021 now. Gen 6 started 2013. Oh my lord. Xatu's been present in you forever, it feels like. But so, where has Xatu ended up struggling? And then what has kind of just made a lot of still disregard some of these struggles? Because I do think there's like some important stuff to note about how Xatu manages to still succeed and find a lot of success regardless of where it falls short. I think the first big thing to note, and it's something that Xatu really doesn't end up managing to bounce back from too effectively regardless, is the fact that, like we've said, the bulk isn't very good. While you do have the bulk to take like a one super effective hit from like a Passimian or something, you know, you could take that knockoff. You could take maybe just one heavy hit from some other neutral wall breaker, like a Tauros' Life Orb Body Slam. The fact of the matter is, you can't keep up with the stronger wall breakers. You really can't. You can't. Like, things like Pangoro are always gonna just bash you in. Exploud's always gonna bash you in. Something like a Whimsicott Specs Moonblast, like if rocks are up, you're gone. Things like Aerodactyl, they outspeed you, they're annoying. Sneasel outspeeds you, it's annoying. They're just... You ever just think about like other neutral attacks, right? Like Heliolisk Specs Hyper Voice. You know, it doesn't even have to try to predict you in T-Bolt, it could just H-Voice. You know, you got a ground type and nothing to switch it on the H-Voice. It doesn't care. It's H-Voicing the Xatu. It doesn't have to play greedy. I've mentioned a lot of Pokemon that really aren't that relevant for Xatu matchups, but the point that I'm trying to get here is that a lot of neutral wall breakers still just muscle past Xatu. Like, again, Tauros's Explouds. If you talk about SMNU, not Life Orb Druddigon, no. But like Dragonium Z Druddigon. There are a lot of Pokemon that just get by you. And while we're on the topic, too, of a Mon that, you know, kind of known for setting up hazards, so, in a lot of gens, obviously, if you've got this Mon that beats up on all the passive Stealth Arc setters, well, naturally, people are going to use more offensive ones. And so, we're talking about Oras, right? Rhydon, another incredibly prevalent Pokemon in the hazard game. Well, that just beats Xatu. Offensive Garbodor, we've seen that set in both Gen 6 and 7. It's a good lure for Xatu. In Gen 7, obviously, Moldbreaker Druddigon literally does not ever care about Xatu. Curse Steelix has existed before as a countermeasure. You curse up twice, you can EV it to where your Gyro Ball, if you run that, will Oko Xatu. Seismitoad in Gen 7 would run Z moves, and that would let you just bop Xatu right as it comes in. Gen 8's a little weirder, as we mentioned. But as Palossand and Rhydon see a little bit more usage, we might see Xatu falter a little bit more in the sort of denying the hazards game. But every gen has like some Stealth Arc setters or some hazard setters, period, that are able to just make life hell for Xatu. But there's an important point that still comes from all of this. Does it really matter? Think about it like this, right? Xatu is a Pokemon that's all about rewarding your aggressive play. That's how you get the most mileage out of it. That's how you can, essentially, you can dictate an entire game with your Xatu. It's sort of like Comfy in Sun and Moon, where that Mon just sort of dictates games in ways that very few others can try to replicate. And Xatu, I think, is worth mentioning in this similar vein. Why do I care if you've got an offensive Seismitoad? It's still a 50-50 on whether or not I'm throwing my Xatu out. Why do I care if your Stealth Rockers are Rhydon? I'll still throw my Xatu in on the rocks. Very fun ladder play experience, I remember, in early Sun and Moon. Playing against former NU tier leader Disjunction, by the way. Really fun time. He has an Aurora sound. I got a Xatu on my team. I look at him like, you're rocking up. I don't care. And I hearted into it, and I bounced rocks back. The point of what I'm going for here is, it doesn't really matter if your opponent's Rocker or Hazard Center, if they're like an offensive Garbodor, for instance. It doesn't matter if they beat Xatu, because Xatu's mere presence is so stupidly strong. Xatu dictates what happens on the field just by being on your, in your team. It doesn't have to be on the field to dictate how the turn's good. No, just having Xatu there. The fact that you can switch your Xatu into the opponent's Hazard Center means that your opponent has to play around that on every turn they want to maybe set hazards, or maybe want to catch a Xatu. Because again, who's to say I'm going Xatu on that turn? I might not. I might go Xatu hard on your Stealth Rocker that beats me regardless of, its set. It's just, it's a Mon that its impact is sometimes more felt just from when you see it. Because again, we've talked about how Xatu can come short. As a defensive Pokemon, it's not really spectacular. It's mostly there to take some resisted hits, maybe punish U-turn. If you need to death fodder it off or just let it take one strong hit that it can, you'll do that. Primarily, Xatu exists as a pivot though. One that comes in on these passive Pokemon and then capitalizes on a lot of force switches with pivoting out with U-turn or teleport. But just having it on your team, your opponent knowing that any turn they want to set rocks, they have to wonder if the Xatu's coming in, regardless of what their rocker is, by the way. Only Mold Breaker Druddigon has existed in NU to completely deny that, or, can't forget him, Mold Breaker Pinsir and Oras. Shoutouts eternally. But otherwise, every turn's just a 50-50 coin flip. Am I going Xatu or am I not? Guess you'll have to find out, smiley face. It's one of the most centralizing Pokemon in a way. There's a lot of the time in these tiers where Xatu does find a stranglehold at the top, where we see it in Oras at S rank, where in SM at its peak it was, I don't know if it ever hit S. It definitely hit S at one point, but it peaked at A plus S, right now it's at A. It just centralizes the sort of rockers. Druddigon would still be a great option independent of Xatu existing. But because Xatu is so good in SM, Mold Breaker rocks Druddigon, hell, the offensive sets with Jargonium Z, they're even better. Rhydon, I would say in SM, it does a lot of good defensively, but a big part of it too is it pressures Xatu. I mean, maybe one day in SS we'll see people try to run more offensive Diancie. Or maybe Palossand and Rhydon in this gen to keep their ascension going up. But until then, we're gonna probably keep seeing Xatu just exist to blank a whole bunch of passive Pokemon that can't ever really do anything about it. This video was definitely an interesting one to do. It's one of the longer spotlight type ones I did, but I saw someone talking down on Xatu, and I was just like, wow, this would be a really good topic to cover. How just Magic Bounce enables Xatu to do so much, even in matchups where you look at it and you go, your main task is 10 times harder than it normally would be. As I said, it's a Pokemon that you feel the impact of more while you're playing than while you actually build and consider what you can do to mitigate its effectiveness. I hope you all enjoyed this sort of look back at Xatu. I might try more of these in the future, because I think there are definitely multiple Pokemon that we could look at. Garbodor. Again, we talked about it earlier. Garbodor would be a really fun one to cover because, oh lord, S rank in black and, S plus in black and white, S rank in Oras, or no, it's A plus regardless. really good in Oras, really good in Sun and Moon, and I mean, we see it rearing its head again this gen now. I hope y'all have a lovely day, and I'll catch y'all later. Peace.